I never thought that the twilight years of my life would taste this bitter. And yet here I am, 74 years old, watching the seasons change through a window that no longer belongs entirely to me. My name is Charles Henderson, though everyone in my small town used to call me Chuck, and once upon a time, that name meant something. I was a man who built things with his hands, who provided for a family, who carried bricks, beams, and dreams until they stood upright as houses, barns, fences, and schools. For 40 years I worked in construction, never getting rich, but never letting my children go without a hot meal or a roof over their heads. When my wife, Margaret, was alive, the house felt like a true home. Her laughter in the kitchen, the smell of fresh pies cooling on the window ledge, the gentle scolding she gave me when I stayed too long in the garage, tinkering with tools instead of coming in for supper. She has been gone for 6 years now, taken by cancer that seemed to grow overnight and leave me staring at an empty chair across from me at the dinner table. Since that day, the house has never been the same, and neither have I. I tried, God knows I tried, to keep going as though she were still there, setting 2 plates out on the table, even when there was only one of us, folding laundry, and putting half of it away in drawers that would never again be opened by her hands. But grief has a way of shrinking a man's world. I used to be surrounded by people, neighbors asking me for help with repairs, grandkids running across the yard, Margaret calling me in from the porch. Slowly, all of it faded until I was left with silence. Silence and the slow ticking of the grandfather clock that had belonged to my parents. For a while, that silence was my only companion. When my health began to fail after a heart operation 3 winters ago, it was my son, Robert, who suggested that I move in with him and his wife. He said it with the air of a man who was doing the decent thing, the honorable duty of a child toward his father, and I believed him. I wanted to believe that after years of raising him, guiding him, giving him every ounce of strength I had, he would welcome me not as a burden, but as a father who still had wisdom and love to offer. I thought perhaps living under one roof again might even heal the distance that had grown between us over the years. Robert was always my difficult child, stubborn, quick-tempered, impatient, and ambitious in ways I never fully understood. He was not like me, nor like his mother. Where Margaret was patient and kind, Robert was sharp, always looking for ways to climb higher, to outdo others, to prove something invisible, but burning inside him. As a boy, he would kick against every rule, argue against every suggestion, and though I admired his fire, I also worried that he would never know peace. I thought that by the time he became a man, marriage and fatherhood would smooth his edges, the way life smooths the stones in a riverbed. But instead, I found him harder, colder, and more calculating with each passing year. When he offered me a room in his house after my surgery, I felt a flicker of gratitude, a spark of hope that perhaps the bond between us could be mended. I packed my clothes, my photographs, my worn Bible, and a few of Margaret's things I couldn't bear to leave behind. Walking through the doorway of Robert's home for the first time, I told myself that this was a chance to live out the rest of my years with family, to hear voices again in the evenings instead of empty silence, to smell dinners cooking that weren't just reheated leftovers. I wanted so badly to believe that I was stepping into a new chapter, one that would carry me gently toward the end of my story, with dignity and love. At first, it almost seemed true. The room Robert gave me was small, but it had a window looking out over the yard, and I could hear the dog barking when the mailman came by, which reminded me of the rhythm of life. His wife Sharon brought me tea the first night and asked if I needed anything. I thought I saw a kindness in her eyes, a softness that Robert had always lacked, and I told myself that even if my son struggled with tenderness, his wife might make up for it. But as the days passed, I began to notice the little things that told me I was not seen as a father or a man, but as a piece of old furniture that had been dragged inside out of obligation. It started with the way they spoke to me, as if I were a child who needed instruction on how to sit, when to eat, where to place my shoes. "Dad, don't leave your cane by the door. Someone might trip." "Dad, don't use too much hot water when you shower. The bill's been high." "Dad, maybe you should eat smaller portions. You know how your heart is." Each comment was delivered with a smile that didn't reach their eyes, and each one chipped away at the illusion that I was welcome. Still, I swallowed my pride, telling myself that gratitude was more important than pride, that perhaps I was being overly sensitive. After all, they had taken me in when they could have left me alone in my old creaking house. But the truth was darker, and it revealed itself slowly, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. I began to hear the whispers when they thought I was asleep. Late at night, when the television was turned low, Robert's voice, sharp and irritated. "He costs us more than he gives. The pills, the food, the doctor visits. I didn't sign up for this." Sharon's voice, lower, cautious, but complicit. "What did you expect? He's old. He's not going to get better. Maybe we should think about other options." Their words cut deeper than any knife, because they confirmed what my heart had feared since Margaret's death, that to my own son I had become a burden, an extra mouth, a weight dragging down his life. I tried to make myself smaller after that, quieter, less visible. I stayed in my room longer, ate less, spoke less. I thought maybe if I took up less space, if I needed less, they would find it easier to bear me. But humiliation is a strange beast. It does not shrink with silence. It grows. Every attempt I made to disappear only seemed to confirm their belief that I was fading, that I was no longer fully a man, but a shadow of one. They began to treat me not with respect, but with condescension, speaking slowly to me as though I were deaf, making decisions about me without asking, shuffling me aside when guests came over, as if I were some embarrassing secret. Through it all, I held on to my memories, because they were the only proof I had that I was once more than this. I remembered carrying Robert on my shoulders at the county fair, his small hands gripping my hair as he laughed and pointed at the Ferris wheel. I remembered teaching him how to swing a hammer, his face glowing with pride, the first time he drove a nail straight into the wood without bending it. I remembered Margaret rocking him to sleep in the old chair by the window, singing softly until his eyes closed. Those memories lived inside me like embers, small but burning, and I clung to them as evidence that I had not always been an unwanted presence. that once I was needed, once I was loved, and yet, as the days turned into months in my son's house, I began to sense a change in him, a hardness that bordered on cruelty. He no longer asked how I was feeling. He no longer offered a chair at the table without sighing as though I had inconvenienced him. He began to speak to me only when necessary, and even then, his words dripped with impatience. "Don't spill that on the rug, Dad. You're in my way, Dad. Didn't I tell you not to leave the light on?" Each phrase was a reminder that I was not an equal in this house, but an intruder. I used to think the worst fate for an old man was loneliness, but I was wrong. The worst fate is being surrounded by family and yet feeling utterly alone, to live under the same roof as your flesh and blood and know that they do not want you there, that your presence is tolerated only out of duty or calculation. Loneliness in an empty house is painful, yes, but loneliness in a house full of people who look at you with resentment is a different kind of torment altogether. So I sat by the window of that small room, day after day, watching the dog run across the yard, watching the leaves fall and the snow cover the ground, wondering when my son stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as an obstacle. I wondered whether I had failed him somehow, whether the years I spent working, sacrificing, giving had meant nothing. I wondered if Margaret would be ashamed of what had become of us, and though I tried to push the thoughts away, one question lingered like a shadow that would not lift. How long would it be before Robert decided that even the little space I occupied was too much? The night it all began, the night when a single sentence carved itself into my memory like a scar that will never fade, was not extraordinary at first glance. It was one of those quiet evenings when winter presses its cold hand against the windows, when the wind rattles the branches outside and the dog curls up in his corner near the kitchen door. I had gone to bed earlier than usual, but sleep would not come. The aches in my chest had been stronger that day, the kind of dull, nagging pain that reminds you how fragile your body has become, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of Robert and Sharon in the living room. Their laughter was low and uneven, touched with the slur of too many glasses of wine. I thought little of it at first. It was not unusual for them to drink on weekends, and though I disapproved silently, I had long since lost the right to voice my opinion in their house. It was past midnight when I heard the door to my room creak open and Robert's shadow fill the frame. I sat up, concerned, thinking something had happened, but instead of urgency, there was only the heavy smell of alcohol rolling off him. His eyes were glassy, his jaw tight, and he looked at me with the kind of expression a man reserves for a stranger who has overstayed his welcome. "You know, Dad," he said, his voice thick and uneven, "this isn't working out. You're always in the way, always sitting around, costing me money. Hell, there's barely room for us anymore." He paused then, swaying slightly, and gave a laugh that was more bitter than amused. "Maybe you should sleep in the doghouse. At least the dog knows his place." The words hit me harder than any fist could have. For a moment I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. Sleep in the doghouse. He said it so casually, as though it were a reasonable solution, as though the man who had raised him, clothed him, and sacrificed a lifetime to build the very roof over his head could be equated with a mutt that barked at passing cars. My throat tightened, my hands trembled on the blanket, and all I could manage to say was his name, Robert, in a voice that cracked like old wood splitting under pressure. But he only shrugged, turned, and staggered back toward the sound of Sharon's laughter. The door closed, and I was left in silence, my heart pounding against my ribs as though it wanted to break free. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the dark yard, watching the dog's silhouette shift restlessly in his kennel. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have reacted if she had heard our son speak to me that way. She would have risen to her full height, her voice sharp with indignation, defending me with a ferocity only a mother could summon. But she was gone, and with her went the last shield between me and Robert's growing contempt. Alone in that room, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life, as though my very existence had been reduced to something disposable. The next morning, Robert behaved as if nothing had happened. He stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his temples, complaining of a hangover, and when he caught sight of me sitting at the table, he gave a dismissive wave. "Don't look so sour, Dad." I was joking. "You take everything too seriously." Sharon, who was frying eggs at the stove, glanced at me but said nothing, though I could see in her eyes that she had heard the words too, and that she would never forget them. Joking, he called it, as though humiliation could be wrapped in humor and served without consequence. But I had felt the truth in his tone the night before, the raw honesty that slips out when wine loosens a man's tongue. That was no joke. That was the voice of a son who had come to see his father as little more than a nuisance, a body taking up space in a house he wanted to claim entirely as his own. For days afterward, those words echoed in my mind whenever I walked past the kitchen door and saw the dog wagging his tail in his kennel. I could not escape the image of myself crawling into that space, curling up beside the animal, trying to stay warm through the night. I had never felt so humiliated, so degraded, not even during the hardest years when money was short and pride was bruised by endless labor. Back then, even in poverty, I had dignity. Now, under the roof of my own son, I had none. It was not just the cruelty of the suggestion that pierced me. It was the casualness. He did not shout it in anger, did not spit it out in a moment of heated rage. He said it almost thoughtfully, like an option on the table, like a solution to an inconvenience. That was what tore at me most, the realization that my son could look at me, his father, and see not a man, not even a relative, but a problem to be managed, a piece of clutter to be pushed aside. I found myself withdrawing even more after that night. I began to spend hours in silence, afraid that any word I spoke might draw his irritation, that any movement might provoke another remark. I tried to help in small ways, sweeping the porch, folding laundry, feeding the dog, but each effort was met with either indifference or annoyance. "Don't bother, Dad, you'll just hurt your back." "Leave it, you'll make a mess." "Why are you doing that? We don't need your help." Every attempt at usefulness became another reminder of my uselessness. Yet the sentence he had thrown at me would not leave my mind. It clung to me through every hour of the day. At night, I would wake suddenly, my chest tight, hearing his voice again. Maybe you should sleep in the doghouse. I began to wonder whether he truly meant to push me there, whether one day, after too many drinks or too many arguments with Sharon, he might actually order me outside, lock the door, and leave me in the cold. The fear of it sank deep into my bones, and though I told myself I was being foolish, that such cruelty could not truly come from my own flesh and blood, I knew in my heart that the possibility was real. The catalyst of a man's downfall is rarely a grand event. It is often a single moment, a single phrase that shatters the fragile balance and exposes the truth we have long been avoiding. That night, in the doorway of my small room, Robert did not just insult me. He revealed to me who he had become and how he truly saw me. And once seen, it could not be unseen. No matter how many mornings he laughed it off, no matter how many times Sharon tried to smooth over the silence that followed, the truth had been spoken. My son had told me in plain words that my place in his life was no greater than the dog's, perhaps even less. I carried that wound with me, hidden from their eyes, but burning with every passing day. It was the moment that marked the beginning of the end. Though neither Robert nor Sharon realized it then, they thought they could speak cruelty and bury it beneath routine, but I knew better. Words have weight. They sink into the soul, they fester, and sooner or later they demand reckoning. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that the words about the doghouse had been nothing more than the drunken slip of a tongue, something my son would regret if he remembered it clearly. I wanted to believe that shame would catch up with him in the sober light of morning, that he would come into my room, sit down in the chair opposite mine, and say he had spoken cruelly, that it was not what he truly meant. But the apology never came. Instead, what followed was a steady, deliberate pattern of changes, so small and quiet at first that I could almost have overlooked them, but together they grew into a wall that pushed me farther and farther into the margins of my own life. It began with my room. The space Robert had given me when I first moved in was modest, but it had a bed, a dresser, and a window where I could watch the seasons pass. One morning Sharon came in carrying a bundle of towels and announced that they were reorganizing the house. "We need the bigger room for storage," she said lightly, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Robert has files, and I want to set up a sewing corner. It makes sense if you move into the back room. It's smaller, but it will be cozier for you." Before I could even process what she had said, Robert was already hauling my dresser into the hallway, his face set with grim determination, as though this were a task he had wanted to complete for weeks. I followed, stunned, into the little back room she had mentioned, which had once been a pantry and smelled faintly of onions and damp wood. They had put a narrow cot there, nothing more. "It will be fine," Sharon said, her tone final. "At your age, you don't need much space anyway." That phrase, "at your age," struck me like a hammer. It was the beginning of their justification for every indignity that followed. At my age, I didn't need a proper chair in the living room. At my age, I didn't need to cook for myself because they would handle it. At my age, I didn't need to go into town alone because someone might have to rescue me. Each restriction was framed as care, as consideration, but I could feel the bars closing in around me. My independence, once taken for granted, was being stripped away piece by piece until I was nothing more than a dependent body under their control. Meals became another battlefield. Margaret used to set our table with warmth, always making sure there was enough for everyone and then some. But in Robert's house, the food was rationed with a precision that made me feel like an intruder at his table. Sharon began to serve my plate separately, smaller portions, different food entirely. "You shouldn't eat too much meat," she would say, placing vegetables in front of me. "Your heart can't handle it." Robert would sit across from me, cutting into his steak, sipping his glass of wine, and watching me with a look that carried no sympathy, only a faint smirk, as though he enjoyed the spectacle of his father being treated like a child. If I protested, even gently, Sharon would sigh and Robert would snap, "She's just looking out for you. Stop being ungrateful." Gratitude, it seemed, was expected of me at every turn, though respect was never returned. There were moments when the humiliation was sharper, when it came not as a quiet erosion, but as a deliberate strike. Once, when guests came over, neighbors of Robert's, people I did not know well, I attempted to join them in the living room. I thought perhaps I could sit quietly, listen to their conversation, enjoy the sound of human company. But Robert intercepted me at the doorway, blocking my path with a forced smile. "Dad, why don't you stay in your room tonight? You'll be more comfortable there." His words were coded in politeness, but his eyes carried the hard edge of command. I retreated, my face burning, hearing their laughter spill into the hallway as the door closed behind me. I sat on the cot in my cramped little room, listening to their voices muffled through the walls, feeling more like an unwanted tenant than a father. The Doghouse comment had not been forgotten. It became an unspoken threat, a shadow hanging over me every time I walked through the yard. Robert had taken to joking about it when he was in a particularly sour mood. "Better behave, Dad, or I'll put you out with Max." Sharon would laugh, though the laughter was hollow, and I would force a smile, though my insides twisted. What had once been a passing remark was becoming a symbol, a warning that I was only tolerated as long as I caused no trouble. The deeper humiliation, however, came from the way my own identity began to dissolve in their house. In the beginning, I had brought with me small tokens of the life I once lived. A framed photograph of Margaret and me on our wedding day, a box of tools I had used for decades, the Bible my mother had given me when I was 15. Slowly, those items disappeared. Sharon reorganized the room and placed the Bible on a high shelf where I could barely reach it. The photograph vanished entirely. When I asked about it, she claimed she had stored it for safekeeping, but could not remember where. My tools were moved to the garage, where Robert locked them away, saying I might hurt myself if I tried to use them. Piece by piece, the things that tethered me to myself, that reminded me I was still Charles Henderson and not just some frail body in a cot, were taken. I began to notice Robert speaking differently about me to others, as though I were not standing right beside him. On the phone, I overheard him tell a friend, "Yeah, Dad's with us now. He's not really capable of much anymore, just sort of putters around." To Sharon, he would mutter, "He's slipping. You can tell he's not all there." Each time I heard such words, I felt the ground shifting beneath me, as though they were building a case in whispers, laying the foundation for something I did not yet understand. They spoke of me in the past tense, as though I were already half gone, as though the man I had been no longer existed. It was not only words, but gestures, subtle but unmistakable. The way Sharon would reach for my arm to guide me as though I were blind. The way Robert would snatch bills from my hand at the pharmacy, saying he would handle the payment. The way they spoke in hushed tones when I entered the room, falling silent until I left. Each act by itself was small, but together they painted a picture of a man being erased, a man being gently but firmly pushed toward the edges of existence. There was one evening, late in January, when I overheard something that turned my unease into dread. They thought I was asleep, but I was lying awake on my cot when their voices drifted down the hallway. Sharon whispered, "We can't keep doing this forever. He's eating into our savings. The doctor visits, the medication, it's too much." Robert's reply was sharper, harder. "I know. I'm working on it. There are ways. We'll figure it out." I held my breath, listening to the silence that followed, my heart thudding in my chest. The words were vague, but the intent was clear. I was not a father to be cherished in my last years, but a problem to be solved, an expense to be managed. That was the first escalation. The Doghouse comment had been the spark, but now the fire was spreading, consuming my dignity in quiet flames. I was no longer just unwelcome. I was being slowly stripped of space, of autonomy, of identity. They were not content to let me fade naturally with age. They were hastening the process, nudging me toward invisibility, until the day would come when I would be so diminished that no one would question it if I simply vanished altogether. I still clung to hope in those days, hope that perhaps my son's better nature might reemerge, that somewhere beneath the hardness there remained a boy who once laughed on my shoulders and sought my approval. But each look, each word, each restriction told me otherwise. I was not a father in that house. I was a burden being prepared for disposal. The breaking point came one afternoon in early spring, a season that should have carried the promise of renewal, but instead brought me face to face with the truth I had been avoiding. The snow had melted into gray puddles in the yard, and the first shy shoots of grass were pushing their way through the earth. I had taken to spending long hours near the window, watching those small green blades as if they alone were proof that life could still fight its way out of the cold. It was on such an afternoon that I wandered into the living room, while Robert was at work and Sharon was on the phone, her voice low but urgent. She was pacing back and forth, papers clutched in her hand, speaking in a tone that immediately told me she was discussing something she did not want me to hear. I had not intended to eavesdrop, but the words carried clear enough. "Yes, we're looking into guardianship," she said. "His mind isn't what it used to be, and the doctor could probably be convinced to sign off if we explain the situation properly. Once that's in place, we can handle the property however we need to. Selling the house will give us enough for the down payment on the condo. It's time to stop living like we're caretakers. This isn't sustainable." I froze, my hand resting on the back of the chair, my body trembling, though the room was warm. Guardianship. The word sliced through me, bringing with it a cascade of understanding. They weren't just trying to humiliate me into silence, weren't just trying to make me smaller until I disappeared. They were planning to take away the last thing I still had, my autonomy, my right to decide the course of my own life. They wanted to declare me incompetent, to make me legally a child again, powerless to resist whatever choices they made about me, my body, my home. And worse, they wanted to sell the house I had built, with Margaret, brick by brick, beam by beam, with sweat dripping down my back and hope filling my chest. That house was not just walls and a roof. It was the embodiment of a life we had lived, a sanctuary that had sheltered our children, a place where Margaret's laughter still seemed to echo in the rooms if I closed my eyes. To hear that they would sell it, as if it were a piece of unwanted furniture, shattered something inside me that I had thought unbreakable. Sharon ended the call and glanced toward the hallway where I stood. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw in her gaze not guilt, but calculation, the quick mental check of whether I had heard enough to become a problem. She forced a smile, too quick, too brittle. "Oh, you startled me," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "Do you need anything, Charles?" I shook my head and retreated before she could see the storm gathering in my chest. Back in my small room, I sat on the cot with my hands gripping my knees so tightly that the knuckles ached. I could hear my own breath rasping, shallow and uneven, like the breath of a man running, though I had not moved an inch. The truth was laid bare now, undeniable and vicious. They wanted me gone, not just physically, but erased legally, stripped of dignity and rights, reduced to a signature on a paper that said I no longer had the capacity to live as myself. I thought back to Margaret then, as I often did when despair threatened to consume me. She had always believed the best of people, always urged me to forgive, to be patient, to trust that kindness would prevail. But what would she say now if she could see her son conspiring to strip me of the last remnants of myself? Would she weep, or would she rage? For the first time in many years, I wished she were beside me, not to comfort, but to fight, to stand at my side and remind them that I was still here, still strong enough to resist. Instead, I had only her memory and the hollow knowledge that she was not coming back. That night, I lay awake long after the house had gone silent, staring at the cracked ceiling above my bed. I thought about the papers Robert had convinced me to sign after Margaret's death, the ones that had placed the title of the house in his name. He had told me it was for simplicity, that it would be easier for taxes, that it was only a formality since we were family. I had believed him. I had trusted that my son would never betray me in such a way. Now I realized those papers were part of the trap, that the foundation of their plan had been laid long before I even stepped into this house. They wanted to erase me so they could claim what was left of my life as their own. I do not know how long I sat there in the darkness, my heart heavy with betrayal, but I do know that something shifted in me that night. Until then, I had been shrinking, folding myself into corners, telling myself that survival meant silence. But when I heard Sharon's voice on that call, When I understood the scope of what they were planning, silence no longer seemed possible. I realized that if I continued to allow them to diminish me, if I continued to accept every cut as though it were only a scratch, then one day I would wake up to find that I had been erased entirely, that the man I once was had been signed away on some legal document without even a fight. And that, I decided in the quiet of that terrible night, I could not allow. I woke the next morning with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sick knowledge that the conversation I had overheard was not a fever dream, but a plan inching toward execution. And from that moment, I began to move through the house as a man who knows a storm is coming, yet has only his two hands and whatever he can salvage to keep himself from being washed away. So I listened more closely than I ever had in my life. I watched where Sharon filed papers and which keys Robert slipped into his pocket. I noted the way their voices softened whenever the word assessment appeared, as if weakness could be coaxed into existence by careful, pitying syllables. 2 days later, Sharon announced, as though it were a gift, that she had scheduled me for a routine checkup with a new doctor who, she said, was closer and more familiar with geriatric needs. And although the explanation was dressed in lavender concern, I could smell the vinegar beneath it. Yet I agreed to go because refusing would have given them the scene they wanted, and because a man who is being weighed should step onto the scale with a straight back. In the waiting room, she filled out the forms for me, answering questions I could have handled on my own, circling symptoms I did not claim. And when I reached to take the clipboard, she laughed lightly, the laugh people use on toddlers, and told the nurse that fine motor control had become a challenge, which was a lie that landed like a stone in my stomach. The doctor, a capable enough man whose eyes kept darting to the clock, spoke to Sharon more than to me, and when he finally turned toward me, his questions arrived like darts thrown at a board. What year is it? Who is the president? Where do you live? And I answered clearly, refusing to stumble. Yet I could feel the way narrative works in the world, the way the person who arrives first with a story plants stakes in the mind of anyone who hears it. So even my correct answers felt as if they were swimming against the current Sharon had created with her breathless anecdotes about misplaced keys and the confusion spells she claimed to have witnessed. Upon leaving, she pressed a small paper bag into my hands with the new pills the doctor had prescribed for sleep. And that night, when I took one, because I was afraid not to, I felt myself sink into a heavy fog that turned the edges of the room soft and made time run in slow syrup. And in that viscous quiet, I understood that the purpose of the pill was not rest, but pliability. For a sedated man is easier to shepherd wherever you want him to go, and later it is easier to tell a judge that the man was dazed because of age rather than chemistry. I started to spit the pills into my palm when they weren't looking and slip them into the lining of my coat. And while that small act of defiance steadied me, it did nothing to slow the other changes that gathered like thunderheads on the horizon. Robert took my wallet for safekeeping after a short trip to the pharmacy, promising to return it, and then, somehow, forgetting for a week. And when it was finally back in my drawer, the credit card was missing, a coincidence he waved off with bored. impatience, saying the bank must have sent a replacement that never arrived, and I saw his eyes slide away from mine the way a boy's eyes slide when he has knocked over something fragile and wants to blame the wind. My old flip phone, the one with Margaret's number still saved in it, although the line had been dead for 6 years, suddenly refused to power on, and Robert said chargers were expensive and unnecessary when there was a landline in the kitchen, available any time, by which he meant any time they were in the room to hear what I said. And I learned to make my voice small just to speak to the pharmacist about refills, while Sharon lingered within earshot, pretending to sort coupons. When the mail came, I noticed that envelopes with county seals were no longer left on the hall table, but disappeared into the delicate purse she kept on the counter. And one afternoon, while she was upstairs, I saw an envelope poking from its mouth, stamped with the assessor's office return address. My hand moved of its own will, and I slit it with the paring knife, finding inside a property tax statement that listed, in a tiny line near the bottom, a phrase I had almost forgotten since the lawyer read it to me years ago: retained life estate. The word struck me like a bell in a dark room, ringing through the fog, and I remembered the day after Margaret's funeral, when the title company had updated the deed so the children's inheritance would be simple, the clerk explaining that if I signed there I could place the remainder in Robert's name while keeping a life estate in the property, the right to occupy and control its use until my death. I had not thought of that phrase in years, yet here it was, printed by the county. Not a rumor or a memory, but a fact with a seal on it. I did not parade that discovery. I tucked it against my ribs like a warmed stone and began to look for more stones to heat my resolve. And that is how I came to spend a damp afternoon in the garage, pretending to search for birdseed while I opened boxes Robert had labeled old paperwork. Beneath a tangle of Christmas lights, I found a folder from the bank, and inside it, a loan statement I had never seen before, a home equity line of credit with a balance so steep my breath caught, the interest gnawing like termites through the beams of everything I had built, and scheduled draws made in amounts that matched the dates I remembered Robert coming home with the new gadgets, a weekend trip, and once a down payment on a shiny truck he said his job demanded. In that stack was also a letter stamped delinquent in red, and even if you have never been a contractor, you can read the handwriting of debt when it is scrawled that large. Now the chatter I had heard about a condo and getting out from under became clear, and the guardianship scheme resolved into focus not as a matter of concern for my well-being, but as a lever to move me aside so that the property could be liquidated to cover the canyon he had carved in the bank's patience. I slipped the copies I needed inside a plastic sleeve and hid them in the hollow of a broken shop vac, then returned the boxes exactly as I had found them, brushing dust over my fingerprints as if I were cleaning a crime scene and not simply trying to survive one. That evening, when I sat at the table and reached for the salt, Robert snatched the shaker as if I had grabbed a pistol, lecturing me about dietary restrictions, and when I reminded him I had been feeding myself since he was a bundle of noise in a crib, he slammed his palm on the table so hard the dog flinched under his chair, and for a long moment we looked at each other like two men standing on opposite banks of a river that had grown too wide to ford, and I realized with a sadness that was almost a relief that he had no intention of building a bridge, that he would rather see me swept away than admit the current owed me any respect. Later that night, I heard the garage door open and the murmur of voices, and though the words were muffled, I caught enough to understand there would be a visit from Adult Protective Services, couched as a wellness check, prompted by concerns, and I saw the choreography of it. A groggy old man, made groggier by sleep aids he had accepted in trust, a daughter-in-law with folded hands, a son with furrowed brow, a stack of anecdotal evidence, delivered with the polished sorrow of people who were only doing what was necessary. When the knock came 2 days later, I had already prepared myself, rinsing my eyes in cold water, standing straighter than my spine liked. And when the social worker sat with me in the cramped back room, I spoke in complete sentences that wound through the facts without anger, showing her the tax bill, with the life estate line, describing the pills and how they made my thoughts slow. And while she kept her face as neutral as a clock, I noticed her pen move more quickly when I said that the doctor had never asked about dosage interactions or adverse effects, only nodded along as Sharon provided the narrative. She did her job that day, left a card, promised to follow up, and when she stepped out onto the porch, Robert's smile fell away as if it had been a mask that tired his cheeks, and he closed the door with a slowness that felt like a fuse being lit. The retaliation was not the drama of slammed doors or shouted curses. It was the bureaucratic cruelty of changed locks and vanished objects and rules written in the air. My room was stripped of its small comforts. The blanket Margaret had knitted was at the cleaners, the lamp with the warm bulb replaced by a cold LED that hummed and turned my skin the color of hospital linen, the photograph of our wedding that I had found behind a row of soup cans removed again with a shrug, and the phrase, "We'll find a better frame." Robert informed me that for my safety, I would no longer handle any mail, any money, or any appointments, and that if I wished to go outside, I must sign a sheet on the refrigerator stating where I would be and for how long, a requirement that might have been funny if it hadn't been so grotesque, as if an old man were a library book that could only be borrowed with the proper stamp. The doghouse, which had once been a nasty joke, became a prop in his theater. He began leaving its little door propped open, a clean blanket folded inside as though preparing a guest room, and when he called to the dog each night, his tone carried a second meaning, a message for me that I could hear even when my door was closed. It was late on a Friday when the second escalation broke its surface fully and showed its teeth. Robert came home tense and glassy-eyed, the way men look when dice have turned against them or a creditor has made a call that bit through bravado. And he walked straight to my room without knocking, telling me to gather the few things I needed, because there would be noise in the house for a while, and I would be more comfortable in the shed, which of course was not built for people, only for rakes and the mower and the smell of gasoline. I told him no with a calm I did not know I still possessed, and he smiled the kind of smile men wear when they have already decided, and he lifted my coat from the hook and guided me down the hallway with a hand that hovered a fraction of an inch. From my back, the gesture of a man who wants to push but enjoys making his victim walk under his own power. Sharon stood by the kitchen door and made a show of protest that contained not a single muscle of resistance. And when we reached the yard, the dog trotted ahead of us and looked back with worried eyes, as if he could not understand why the pack was doing this to its elder. Out there, under a sky that smelled like rain, Robert gestured toward the shed, and then, with a theatrical kindness that made me want to laugh, he pointed to the doghouse and said it was dry, warmer than it looked, and if I truly felt cold, I could sleep there until morning. I said his name. Not the name I had used when he was a boy, but the full name his mother used when he had done something that shamed the family. And I told him that if he made me cross that threshold, he would be doing something he would never be able to take back, not in my memory and not in his. And for a second I saw a flicker across his features, a quiver of the boy who once cried when he broke a bird's egg and ran to Margaret to confess, but the flicker died quickly, and he turned on his heel and went inside. I did not climb into the doghouse. I sat in the shed on an upturned bucket, breathing in sawdust and gasoline, until the night bled into dawn, and while the wind pressed against the tin roof, I mapped out the remaining paths I could take, and none of them ran through pleading or endurance or the kind of forgiveness that buys quiet at the price of self. In the gray hour before sunrise, I slipped back into the house while they slept and retrieved what little was still mine: the tax bill with the life estate line, the copies of the loan statements, the paper bag of pills I had not swallowed, and the old leather folder containing a photocopy of the deed from years ago, a faded document Margaret had insisted we keep in the bottom drawer because she never trusted paperless anything. In the file, I found a note she had tucked, written in her slanted hand, reminding me to call Mr. Talley, the lawyer who had helped with the deed, if the children get ideas, and the softness of her warning cut through me, because even when she was alive, she had been watching ahead for me, trying to lay stones across waters she sensed might rise. I hid the folder beneath my shirt, pulled on my coat, and left by the side gate, walking slowly so the dog would not bark, and I made my way along the back lanes of the neighborhood to the bus stop, where I used the few dollars I had tucked into the heel of my shoe, old carpenter's habit, to ride into town and step into the county recorder's office as soon as it opened. The clerk behind the glass did what clerks do. She asked for numbers and dates. She clicked keys with the crisp certainty of someone whose world is bounded by ordinances and archives. And when she turned the screen and showed me the current record, saw my name where it mattered, not big and triumphant, but precisely in the place where rights reside, and the words life tenant glowed brighter than any sunrise could have that morning. I paid for certified copies, slid them into my coat, and then I walked 2 blocks to a quiet bank, where the manager had hair the color of rain clouds, and the courtesy to call me sir. And I explained that I needed a temporary card and a temporary number and a notice placed on my accounts forbidding any third-party transfer without my in-person authorization, which she arranged without theatrics because in her world rules were protective ropes, and I blessed her for living by them. By the time I returned to the neighborhood, the day had warmed into something almost spring-like, and I stood across the street from the house and watched the curtains move as someone passed behind them, and I understood that I was watching the place where my son had chosen to anchor his contempt, a structure mortgaged to the hilt and yet somehow still not paid for, a place that was mine in the only way that mattered because the law, for once, had not forgotten the old. When I opened the door, Robert was waiting, and the scene unfolded the way you might expect. His demand to know where I had been, my simple answer that I had been exercising the rights of a man, his warning that there would be consequences, my reply that consequences would fall where they were owed, and the quiet war that followed as he tried to snatch the folder, and I held it close to my chest with a strength I did not know I still possessed. He did not get the papers. I took them to my room, and I sat on the cot and felt something like a keel settle beneath me, a line running along the length of my life that had not yet cracked. That evening, when Sharon reheated soup and set it on the counter with the care people reserve for glass figurines, I told them I would no longer take the sleep pills, and I would no longer surrender mail or money or speech. And Robert's face changed in a way that men's faces do when they realize their plan will not proceed quietly. And I knew then that the second escalation had reached its crest. They had tried to sedate me, to starve me of autonomy, to push me to the yard and into a house meant for an animal. They had called on bureaucracies and rehearsed their lines for strangers. And still I was here, upright, with papers that said my life was not yet a thing to be signed away. The night that followed was the last night I would spend in that back room, though at the time I could not know it. What I did know was that the next step would be mine, not reaction, but action, and that whatever came would come not from a man begging for mercy, but from a man gathering justice into his hands like rope, ready to pull. The day everything finally erupted was not marked by thunder or storm, but by the quiet ordinariness of a Tuesday, the kind of day when people go about their errands without suspecting that someone's world is about to split open. Robert had returned home earlier than usual, his face flushed with frustration, his tie askew, and his voice already sharp as he called for Sharon. I knew by the sound of his footsteps that he had reached the end of whatever patience he once had, and I braced myself even before the words came spilling out. He barged into my small room without knocking, the smell of cigarettes and cheap whiskey clinging to him, and in his hand he carried a folder that I recognized instantly. It was the notice from the county recorder's office, the one I had taken the precaution of sending so that my rights to the property could not be erased quietly. His eyes blazed as he waved the papers in my face, demanding to know how I had dared to interfere, how I had dared to remind the world that I was still legally alive. I did not answer immediately, because I knew that silence was the most cutting weapon left to me, and the longer I let it hang between us, the more his voice cracked under the weight of his own rage. "You think you're clever, old man," he hissed, his spit flying close to my cheek. "But you don't understand. Everything you've done, every scrap of resistance, it's useless. This house, this life, it's mine. You don't belong here. You never did. If you had any dignity, you'd step aside and let the future move on without you. His words struck with the finality of a sentence already past, but something inside me, some ember I thought long extinguished, flared into a steady flame. For months I had endured the humiliation, the restrictions, the whispered conspiracies. For months I had folded myself into corners, like a piece of old paper, trying to survive quietly. But in that moment, with the man who bore my blood standing over me, as though I were a trespasser in my own life, I realized the moment of reckoning had arrived. I rose slowly from the cot, my knees aching, my back protesting, but my eyes steady, and for the first time in years Robert faltered, taking half a step back as if he had seen something unfamiliar in my face. I told him, in a voice low and clear, that I knew everything. The forged whispers to doctors, the lies fed to neighbors, the guardianship petition he was preparing in secret, the debt he had buried under this house like rot beneath fresh paint. I told him I had the documents to prove it, the bank records, the tax statement, the loan statements, with his name bleeding across every line. I told him I had already placed copies where he could never touch them, entrusted to people who would not be silenced. Sharon appeared in the doorway then, her face pale, her hand clutching the frame as if she were trying to hold the house upright with her own body. She tried to intervene, to calm him, but Robert's fury only grew, and he shouted that if I wanted to act like a stranger, then I would be treated like one. That was when he gave the command, sharp and brutal, "Get out. Tonight. I don't care where you go. You don't live here anymore." His voice echoed through the hall, loud enough for the neighbors to hear if they had pressed their ears to the walls, and for a moment silence followed, the kind of silence that seems to stretch across centuries. I did not move. Instead, I looked at him with the calmness of a man who has already endured the worst and can no longer be threatened by exile. I told him I would leave, yes, but not as a beggar in the night. I would leave as the rightful owner of my life, and I would take with me everything that was still mine. I told him that if he put his hands on me, if he tried to drag me out like trash, the police would be here within minutes, and they would not be looking at a helpless old man, but at a son who had crossed into criminal cruelty. My words shook him, not because he feared the law, but because for the first time he realized I was not broken. The shouting match that followed spilled into the kitchen, then into the yard, with Sharon wringing her hands and the dog barking madly in its kennel, sensing the fracture of the pack. Robert hurled accusations that I had ruined his life, that I had poisoned his marriage, that I had squandered the inheritance he deserved. I countered with truths, that he had stolen, lied, manipulated, and that every brick of this house carried my sweat as much as his entitlement. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the spectacle, whispering to each other, their faces pale with the shock of seeing a son drive his father toward the street like an animal. And then came the moment that will never leave me. Robert, trembling with fury, pointed toward the doghouse, his voice hoarse as he screamed, "That's where you belong. That's where you should sleep." But I did not move toward it. Instead, I stepped past him, past Sharon, past the stunned neighbors, and I walked down the driveway with my head high. In my pocket was the folder of documents. In my coat was the envelope of cash I had prepared, and in my heart was a clarity I had not felt in years. I told Robert, loud enough for the entire street to hear, that if he wanted me in the doghouse, then he would have to take my place in it, because as of that moment, he was the one without a roof, without security, without the father who had carried him through every storm. I told him I would make sure the world knew what he had done, not through shouting, but through the slow, merciless machinery of law and justice, and that by the time it was finished, it would be he who stood outside, staring in at what he could never reclaim. That was the climax of our war. Not fists, not blows, but words sharpened by years of betrayal, hurled like stones until the air itself seemed to burn. I left him there, red-faced and shaking, the neighbor's eyes heavy upon him. And as I walked away, I felt something inside me lift, as though the chains that had been tightening around my chest had finally snapped. I had been cast out, yes, but I had chosen the direction of my steps, and in that choice, I had taken back the dignity they had tried to strip from me. In the weeks after that final eruption, life shifted in ways both sharp and subtle, and though I left Robert's house with nothing more than a battered suitcase and the documents I had guarded like a flame in the wind, I walked with the strange lightness of a man who has survived his own burial. I did not go to the doghouse, nor to the shed, nor even to the spare couch of some reluctant neighbor. I went instead to a small apartment on the other side of town, one of those modest units reserved for seniors, where the walls are thin, but the rules are clear, and no one can order you into the yard. The manager, a woman with silver hair and a voice full of practical kindness, handed me the keys after glancing at my papers, and for the first time in months, I closed a door behind me that belonged to me and to no one else. The apartment smelled faintly of disinfectant and linoleum, but to me it smelled like freedom, like oxygen after suffocation, and when I spread my few belongings across the counter, I realized that survival does not require abundance. It requires only dignity and the space to breathe as yourself. The legal machinery began to turn almost immediately, because I had made sure of it before I left. The lawyer Margaret had once trusted looked older, but still carried the same sharp eyes, and when I placed the folder of documents on his desk, he nodded with the solemnity of a man who has seen such betrayals before. He explained that my retained life estate made me untouchable in the eyes of the court, that Robert could not sell, mortgage, or evict without my consent, and that his attempts to maneuver around that fact would not only fail, but expose him to scrutiny. Within a fortnight, letters had been sent, notices filed, and the debt he had hidden like mold behind the wallpaper was dragged into the light, where banks and neighbors alike could see it. The home equity loan, the delinquent statements, the manipulations, all of it laid bare until even Sharon's carefully cultivated pity could no longer disguise the truth. I did not need to shout or curse or demand revenge. The slow grind of law was more eloquent than any words I could summon. Neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now looked at Robert with unease, and though they still waved at him in passing, their eyes held questions He could not answer. Whispers spread about the father cast toward the doghouse, and the son who thought himself master of a home built by another man's sweat. Whispers are a kind of justice, too, because they gnaw at reputation in ways money cannot mend. And soon enough, Robert found himself isolated, his pride a stone tied around his own neck. I did not rejoice in his humiliation, but neither did I mourn it. What he carried was the weight of his own making, and if it bent his back, then perhaps it would teach him what he refused to learn from kindness. For myself, I discovered a kind of peace in the small rhythms of the apartment. I made my own breakfast again. Eggs sizzling in a pan, I scrubbed myself. Coffee brewed to the strength I preferred, not measured by someone else's rationing. I walked to the library where the staff knew me by name, and I sat among shelves that smelled of paper and dust and possibility. I spoke with neighbors in the lobby, other old men and women who carried their own scars, and in their company I found not pity, but recognition. We were not burdens, we were survivors, each with stories carved deep into us, stories that deserved to be spoken before silence came. I began to tell mine, slowly at first, then more freely, until I realized that each word pulled me further from the shadows Robert had tried to cast over me. Sometimes, in the evenings, when the light slanted across the blinds, I thought of Margaret and wondered if she would approve of the path I had taken. I like to think she would, that she would see not only the pain, but the defiance, not only the betrayal, but the reclamation of dignity. I kept her photograph on the table by my bed, and each night I told her what had happened that day, as though she were still keeping watch. Perhaps she was. Perhaps it was her hand that steadied mine when I signed the papers at the lawyer's office, or her whisper that told me not to swallow the pills Sharon pressed on me. I will never know for certain, but I know this. I survived because she had planted the seeds of strength in me long before she left, and those seeds grew even in the barren soil of betrayal. As for Robert, I have not seen him since that night in the yard, though word reaches me through others. The house is quieter now, emptier, weighed down by bills and by the absence of a father he thought he could erase. I do not know if he regrets, and truthfully, I no longer care. Regret is his burden, not mine. I gave him everything a father could give, a childhood without hunger, an education paid with calloused hands, a roof built strong enough to last decades. What he chose to do with that inheritance is between him and his conscience. My task now is different, to live what remains of my days, not as a man bent by cruelty, but as a man who refused to be broken. And so the story closes where it began, with me sitting by a window, watching the world beyond the glass. But now, when I look out, I do not see the doghouse waiting in the yard like a threat. I see the street lined with trees just beginning to bloom, the steady traffic of life moving past, the occasional child on a bicycle who glances up and waves. I wave back, and I smile, because I know that whatever years remain to me will be lived on my terms. Robert tried to make me a shadow, but I walked into the light instead. And though the light shows every wrinkle, every scar, it also shows that I am still here, still standing, still my own man. That is enough. That is victory.